maternal grandparents were both English. Her name was Barbara Elizabeth Adamson, and his name was Herbert Joseph Peters. They were married during the First World War, and my paternal grandparents were Irene Marion Horwood Rolls, and my grandfather was Harry Valentine Rolls. He was born in Bonavista, and she was born in Rose Blanche, Newfoundland. My English grandparents, women didn't really work a lot during those times in the early 1900s, but my grandfather was an inspector on the railway and in Nebworth, London, and then he went to Birmingham and worked there, and then to Cleethorpes or Grimsby. Cleethorpes is a suburb of Grimsby. My paternal grandparents, she of course is the same thing, never really worked outside the home, but my grandfather was a teacher in Rose Blanche, and that's how he met my grandmother. And then he became an accountant for their business in Rose Blanche, and then became an insurance agent in Corner Brook when they moved to Corner Brook. My English grandparents had two children. My mother, Barbara Daphne Peters Rolls, and Jeffrey Adamson Peters. That was the two of their children. And my paternal grandparents their children were my father, Calvin William Rolls, and Harry Rossiter Rolls, and Gordon Stewart Rolls. I was born in Corner Brook on August the 1st, 1946, and David was born in St. John's, St. Clair's Hospital on August the 5th, 1947. I had two brothers, David William Rolls, and he was 2 years older than me, and my younger brother, Derek John Rolls, was born in 1953. David's parents did have another son 2 years after David, and his name was Wayne, but he died in the hospital. He never did come home. David's parents were Elander Joseph Wheeler and mother Mary Frances Bolger. Mary Frances Teresa Bolger, I'm sorry. And they were both from St. John's. Grew up there too. Mary had, her father was a what do you call them, a shoemaker, a fixer or whatever. Cobbler. And her mother never worked outside the home, and she had terrible rheumatoid arthritis. So she was always in a lot of pain. Alan's parents, they lived on Quiddyviddy Road, or Quadavada Road, your father would say, and they had 5 boys and 1 girl. And the Bolgers, they had 3 girls and 1 boy. David was born in St. John's and lived in various places in St. John's. He went to school at St. Bon's School, which was a pretty good school at that time here. And in his high school, he went to, the parents moved to Gander, and he went to Gander Academy, and that's where he finished high school. And then he went to Memorial University for a year. But at that time, he failed in mathematics. So he couldn't go back to university the next year, and he took a job at the hospital as an orderly in the X-ray department. And that's where I met him. I was born in Corner Brook. We lived in Curling at the time when I was really small. And then we moved to Steadybrook. And we lived there for a number of years. But unfortunately, our place burnt down, and we had to rent a place up there then. And then my dad he was having a house built in Corner Brook, and we lived on Ellswick Road, at the top of Ellswick Road, and the house is still there. And when my father wanted to go into business on his own, and he did, but what we did was he sold the house and we moved into an apartment at the back of the shop that he had bought, and that was on Callahan's Field, which is not called Callahan's Field anymore, but I can't remember the name of the road. And after that, actually that place burnt down too. It was and then we moved to my grandparents' house up on Stratton's Lane in Corner Brook, and I lived there until I went to England to study radiography. And then when I completed my course and passed, I came back to Newfoundland, but my parents at that time had moved to Traytown. So the closest hospital that I could find to work in was in Gander Hospital. And of course the X-ray department where your father was working, that's where I met him. And the year was 1967. January 1967, and your father and I worked there. Well, I worked there longer because your father came back to university in St. John's. Went back to university in St. John's for the September. I worked in Gander until I think it was October, and then I transferred into the Janeway Children's Hospital, the old Janeway Children's Hospital, in that time, same time. And I worked there for, a year and so many months. And then at university, your father got connected with Mun Radio and had his own show. And he enjoyed it so much that he pursued a summer career at CBC in St. John's, and he got as an operator. And he was hoping to get on as an announcer because he had a wonderful voice and great encouragement from the other announcers there. But he decided to go back. How did that happen? No, he didn't go back to university. He decided to, after CBC did the summer job, he went to and applied to CJON Radio and TV, and they hired him right away. And he started down in Grand Bank at a radio station, CJOX. And I just transferred down to Grand Bank Cottage Hospital from the Janeway. Had no trouble transferring at the time. And so we lived down there for, a year and so many months. And then your father got transferred up to CJCR in Grand Falls. And I transferred up there and I went down to Botwood Hospital. And then I lived in Grand Falls, and so did your father lived in Grand Falls too. That year was 68, because we went down to Grand Bank on the New Year's. We were there for the New Year's Day, and we went to the New Year's dance, and we thought we're not going to enjoy the music very much because we figured it would all be country western. But it turned out they had the best rock and roll band there, Reg and the Rebels, and they won the award for best band in Newfoundland at that time. So it was great down there. We loved Grand Bank. we lived in we were married in Grand Falls in February, and we lived at the apartments there, and well, we didn't really. It was funny because Uncle Don and Shirley came out and visited us there, and we had bought a spin washer, because mainly for Glenn's. At that time, you didn't have Pampers or things like that. You had to wash your own diapers, and the washing machines that were in the buildings, it was getting a bit expensive, so we decided we'd buy a spin dryer. Anyway, Don and Shirley came, and we were sitting down waiting for the spin dryer to arrive, and it got late, so Dad phoned up to the place where we bought it, and they said no, they couldn't deliver it because the manager wouldn't let you have a washing machine in your apartment. So then Uncle Don kept down to Dad saying, "What? It's too, he shouldn't be allowed to do that," and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so Dad had phoned up the manager, and he said, "No, we can't have that rolling back and forth over the floors. It ruined the floors." And Dad said, "Well, I walk back and forth over the floors every day, and I weigh more than the spin dryer does." So anyway, Don said, "Tell him you're leaving." And so Dad said, "Well, I'd like to give my notice in." And but he took it. So then we were stuck. We didn't know what we were going to do. But your father being on the radio, he was getting all these apartments and houses for rent coming in. And one came in which sounded really good. It was down in Bishop's Falls. And we went down, and it was a lady whose husband had recently died, and the house was furnished and everything. And Dad said, he asked the rent. I can't remember the rent, but say it was $300 a month. And when Dad said $300, kind of sounded surprising. She said, "Well, would you take it for $250?" So it was more expensive than that, but that's just an example. But that was funny, and we lived there, Bishop's Falls. We lived between two railway tracks. We didn't live on either side. It was between two, and one road was going into St. John's, and the other one was going down to Botwood. And Glenn's room was right next to the train, but both of us, all of us slept well once we got used to the trains going by. And we lived there until I think we came into St. John's in 1972. When we were in Grand Falls, our first son, Glenn, was born on August the 8th, 1970. And we moved, we left the apartment that we brought him home to and moved to Bishop's Falls. And we had a lovely house there, and it was all furnished, and it was between two railway tracks. But we loved it there. It was really good. We had excellent neighbors, and they were an old couple who came over on Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve night in 1970, and their daughter, who was a nun, and she came over too. Their names were Wilson, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, and we had a grand time. Dad shot off a gun, which was usual at that time at midnight, and it was excellent. We loved it down in Bishop's Falls, more than Grand Falls. But we left Bishop's Falls in 72 and moved into Pleasantville, his parents' place first, because at that time it was very difficult to get a place of your own. And their address was 706C Arnold's Loop, Pleasantville, St. John's. And we, after about 6 months, we got a home across the street from theirs. I can't remember that address, but it was on Arnold's Loop, just the same. And there was more family members on that street too, Rose and Paul Thorburn, David's aunt and uncle. And so Arnold's Loop was populated a lot by the Wheelers. We were living with Dad's parents for about 6 months, and it was getting sort of cramped because we had double everything. Like there was two big sofas and with baby furniture and whatever. So we had such difficulty in finding a place that your father actually asked Joey Smallwood, who was premier at the time, to if he could help. And a month later, a couple that was Bill Rowe's place that we moved into, and he was with the government as well and has written several books. And so we moved in. We were lucky enough to get that apartment, and that's where we moved, right across the street from Dad's parents. And we were there until early 1973, and then we moved to we had a house built and bought land there, and on the Marine Drive in Torbay, on the corner of Quigley's and Doyle's Lane, and it was but our listing was at the Marine Drive, and we lived there until 1980. And Christopher and Michael were both born and lived when they were babies, lived at that house too. Michael was born in 1977 and Christopher was born in 1975. And Glenn had already started school there in kindergarten. And we moved out to Gander in 1975. We moved out there, and Glenn, started kindergarten in Torbay, but he finished kindergarten in Gander. Christopher was only a baby. Michael wasn't born then. And we lived out in Gander until 1976, Christmas 1976, when Dad, the station out there, CJCN, closed up, and Dad got a job with VOCM in St. John's at a better salary. So we moved back to Torbay, and Michael was born in February of that year. And we lived there on the same house until 1980. And then we moved to Quigley's Lane. Another Quigley's, but not Quigley's and Doyle's Lane, another Quigley's Lane. Christopher was born at the Grace Hospital in 1975, February 15th, 1975. And it was a really bad snowstormy year. So I couldn't get... we had a skidoo. Uncle Derek had a skidoo out in the front, and we had talked to Dr. O'Brien, who was our doctor here, and he was going to come over on a skidoo in case I went into delivery. But he said that he advised me to go into St. John's and say I was having a few pains, and they would admit me, which they did. But going up the road wasn't even plowed when Dad arranged for somebody to come down and pick me up, and he walked up to the main road, and Wally Daniels was the driver for VOCM at the time, and he picked me up and drove me into the hospital. And that was a day later Christopher was born. And then with Michael was born at the same hospital on February 28th, 1977. It wasn't as snowy as bed, but it was funny because it was 3 a.m. in the morning, and Nan and Bramper had come in to stay with Christopher and Glenn, and they came in that day, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, Michael decided that he wanted to be born. So, so on the way going out, Dad drove me out. It was so bad because every bump there was a lot of bumps at that time on the road, and every bump, it was so painful. Anyway, I got to the hospital, and they started to ask me all these questions, and all I could think of, I gotta go upstairs because I'm gonna have this baby soon. So anyway, they took me up, and I think it was only about a half an hour, and Michael was born. David was hoping to come into the delivery room, but he didn't. He didn't get changed in time. He didn't have time before Michael was born. So then we came back to brought Michael back to Torbay, and we lived there until 1980. And then we moved to Quigley's Lane. Quigley's Lane was an ideal spot for children to grow up. There were so many young children on the lane at the time and they all got on around the same age, and they all got on very well together and became close friends and are still friends today, which I think is wonderful. And but it was such a lovely place because we were right at the top of the lane, and we had a Cape Cod house, and you could look out from the upstairs windows and see all down around Torbay and everything. But also you were close to a pond, Southern Pond, which you could walk up, and which we did many times, and go swimming. And with rafts, we had rubber rafts too that would go, not rafts, rubber boats that you would go out in. It was an ideal spot, it really was. We loved it up there. We moved to Marine Drive again, but further down, closer to Middle Cove, in 1990. The house was a much larger house, and it had an in-law apartment on it, so that my parents, Michael, Christopher, and Glenn's grandparents, could move in with us, and only for the winter first of all, and then gradually as they got older, probably the whole year. But unfortunately, my dad, he developed cancer and also had heart trouble, but they did come in for several winters, but the last winter they stayed on, and unfortunately he passed away. And then my mother stayed for a couple of winters here, but would go out to Traytown in the summertime to her house. And after 2 or 3 years, I think she realized that it was too hard trying to maintain a house out there and in here, and decided to move in here full time, which was great because she was a very active woman, and we enjoyed the greenhouse, and we enjoyed the plants, and she enjoyed growing vegetables and everything, and together I think we made a good team. I loved the flowers and she loved the vegetables, so it was good. And it was also good in a way that I liked doing the cooking and she liked doing the baking, so which was great. And so she lived with us until 2018. And my husband David passed away in November 2010. So I'm here in this large house right now, all by myself, but I love it here. Yeah. And David and I often used to say that if we won the lottery, we would still keep this house because we liked it so much. Unfortunately, he developed arthritis, which was severe, psoriatic arthritis, and which is very painful. He lost a lot of weight in the beginning when it started to develop, but then gradually put it back on with the drugs that he was taking, would make him look, a bit puffy and everything like that. But he became redundant at VOCM in 2003 or 2004. I can't remember the exact date. And most of his time then we spent on going on holidays with mom. Mom would go with us too, and unfortunately, he really, as he developed, as he got worse, it was hard for him even to move around. So, he, when we were down in Florida once, he fell off a bike and he broke his hip. That was the start of really of him going downhill, and because the drugs that they were giving him for the psoriatic arthritis, if you knew you had an infection, you had to stop him. But of course, being in an internal infection around the hip pinning, that we didn't know that was what it was. And when he was due to go in to have the hip, he was supposed to have a total hip to replace the hip pinning. They found that there was a lot of infection around the hip, and so they couldn't do anything. But unfortunately, he went septic with this infection, and that played a lot of havoc with his condition. And he ended up, first time in hospital, when he was in the hospital, he ended up having a heart attack, and so then they ended up doing a open heart surgery, and he had 5 implants. And then he came home for a couple of years. He was fine, but at the end, when they were going to take him in for the hip replacement, that's when the sepsis had gone into his body. So there was no recovery after that. Our 3 sons. Glenn, at this time, is working as a dispatcher with a helicopter company in Saskatchewan, northern Saskatchewan. Christopher is a disc jockey, and unfortunately, with the COVID-19 pandemic, he has been not very much employed, and he's looking for another job. Our youngest son, Michael, is an RCMP officer who was stationed first in Comox, in Vancouver Island. Beautiful place, and 2 of his sons, Tobin and Liam, were born in Comox. And Carolyn and that's Michael's wife, and Michael and the 2 boys came back to Newfoundland in 2015, and they now live in Torbay. Tobin and Liam are both going to the same school. Well, it was a new school, but it's on the same ground as the schools that the boys went to.